Paul, I want to start with Europe because it's in the headlines every day. How concerned are you about Europe's economy right now?
I'm frankly concerned about the method of intervention that's been agreed to now, because I think what they've done vis-a-vis Greece, I don't think is replicable in other places. That is to say, to cobble up $1 trillion worth of money. I think actually we'd be better off. You know, in a way, I dealt with this issue when I was Secretary of the Treasury, and we had Argentina. And over a period of about 15 months, we got Argentina into a position where we could legitimately say to them, you need to level up with your debt holders and say to them, you can't pay the interest and you're not going to be able to redeem the principal. And I think actually the world would be better off if the Greeks called in their bondholders and said, we're not going to redeem the principal because we don't have the means to do it. We're not going to pay any interest on these things anymore. And the immediate consequence, I think, would be for Greece to have a balanced budget because they wouldn't be able to borrow any more money and they would only be able to spend the money they collect in taxes from their people. Now, people on the other side of this argument say, oh my God, what about contagion? You know, my view of that is the argument about contagion is really an argument for existing bondholders to basically say we would like to be redeemed by people in other places because that's the consequence of what's going on. And I actually think the world's better off nation by nation to have fiscal responsibility, and where it doesn't exist, the people who perpetrated it ought to suffer the consequences.
The current Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, told Bloomberg's Al Hunt last week, Europe can manage through this. At the end of the day, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, but I don't think the current intervention is replicable in Portugal and Italy and Spain and Ireland. And therefore, I think the precedent value of Greece is unfortunate because, you know, people are saying, well, a way for them to solve their problem is to have their own currency again. Well, the implication of them having their own currency is they expropriate their people by stealth instead of frontally saying, hey, we've mismanaged and there are consequences for this.
A lot of people are talking about whether or not the euro is going to go to parity against the US dollar. You think that's going to happen?
You know, over the long run, even over the intermediate run, I think currency exchange rates are set by the markets discounting the expected relative productivity between economies. And so I actually think it makes sense for there to be a strong euro. And parity is not a strong euro, that's for sure. But I don't think that the euro needs to be endangered by the fiscal irresponsibility of some of the members. The consequence, I believe it's true that you can have a strong euro and that's a fix. And the fiscal position of individual countries will be reflected in the earning power of the individual countries, so that if Greece defaulted, their people would fairly quickly have reduced purchasing power in euro terms. And that's because their productivity is lower than the other people who are participants in the euro. So I think the idea of trying to mask or dampen fiscal irresponsibility with monetary policy is a fundamentally bad idea.
How would you compare the fiscal picture here in the United States to the fiscal picture in Europe right now?
You know, we now have, not many people know, $63 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities in the U.S. And, you know, by best estimates, we're going to continue growing the unfunded liabilities and the more transparent accounted for U.S. debt. And, you know, I hope this doesn't happen, but it is not out of the question that we could follow in the path of Greece and other places that have not followed a prudent fiscal policy. And eventually, if we don't change course, we could be a basket case ourselves.
You could see the same kind of economic woes in the U.S. as we're seeing in Greece.
If we don't do anything, let's say, if we just leave things the way they are for 20 years, I think we're on a really bad course, John.
A decade ago, when you were Treasury Secretary, you were very concerned about deficits. We know the Bush administration's perspective on that. Looking back, do you think if they had had a different view on deficits, we'd be having a different conversation today?
I do. You know, when I went into office in January of 2001, we had a fiscal surplus that we'd inherited from the Clinton administration. And I was okay at the time with the early tax cuts, but I argued strenuously against the third tax cut because I thought there were four contending things that we needed to pay attention to. One was this conversation took place in early and mid-2002. I was worried about another 9/11. I was worried then about the prospects of having to go to Iraq and the fiscal consequences of that. I strongly believed we need a fundamental reform of our tax system, and we needed some bridge financing, if you will, to accommodate that. And we needed to reform our entitlement programs, and we needed some bridge financing for that. And so at the time, the best econometric model said if we did the third Bush tax cut, it would increase the potential GDP in the fourth quarter of 2004 by 0.5 percentage point from 3.3 to 3.8. And I said, we don't need it for economic reasons, and there's a pile of four other reasons we shouldn't be doing this. I think if we'd taken my course, we'd be in a very different place, John.
You mentioned the word reform. Let's talk about financial reform.
Okay.
And as part of that, Goldman Sachs, which has also been in the headlines recently. What do you make of the Goldman Sachs story?
Well, I think it's pretty sad, but I tell you what I believe about financial reform. The bill in current state is 1,363 pages. I think it needs to only be 2 pages long. The first page should say, from the day of enactment, shall be illegal in the United States of America for anyone to give or receive a home mortgage without a 20% equity down payment, which shall be forever stapled to the instrument, so that even if it gets traded, the 20% equity protection for the financial system is already there. And the second page of my reform bill would say we're going to have parallel reserve requirements for all financial transactions, so the effective leverage ratio is 5 to 1. And then I would say we have accomplished systemic protection that will assure we never revisit this scene, and it doesn't matter how big banks are because they've always got a 20% equity cushion.
Earlier this year, you and 4 other former Treasury Secretaries came out in support of the Volcker Rule. What do you think J.P. Morgan, Bank of America will look like 2 years from now?
I don't know, but I tell you a footnote on the Volcker Rule. Paul called me and asked me if I would sign this letter that he sent to the Wall Street Journal, which I was happy to do, but I believe this. We didn't say this in the letter. The Volcker Rule doesn't work unless we, the United States, can negotiate a similar provision for financial institutions around the world. If we do the Volcker Rule and it only applies to U.S. institutions, we're going to hurt the U.S. financial position, I think.
Looking back to your time as Treasury Secretary, at that time, how did the White House, how did the Bush administration view financial reform?
I think we had a view, even in the first 23 months when I was there, that Fannie and Freddie were troubled institutions or potentially troubled institutions, and we needed to do something about that. And if we had done something about it, then I think we would certainly have reduced the impact of the subsequent financial engineering, which always had as a root problem the way we dealt with home mortgages. Even today, I think we're rebuilding the problem in a way because the government is providing home equity mortgages with 5% equity down payments. I don't think it's nearly enough.
But you had concerns way back then,
Absolutely.
and the Bush administration had concerns about
Absolutely.
Fannie and Freddie way back then.
Absolutely.